Hello, and welcome to week number 2 of the Watching and Waiting podcast. I'm Rachel Parfinchuk, Director of Music Ministries here at Powell United Methodist Church.
And I'm Kim LaRue, Director of Adult Ministries. And this is our Advent series where we're going to look at the music of Advent. And today we're going to look at a hymn that you probably are really familiar with. It's one of my favorites, and it is O Come, Emmanuel. And I want to think about first this word, Emmanuel, which is coming from both Greek and Latin. Emmanuel, as you know, can be spelled with an E or an I, depending on which language it's coming from. And it means God with us. And that's really critical to the essence of this particular hymn. And Rachel, talk a little bit about where does this come from? Why are we... how is it organized, I guess, a little bit? How did the hymn come to us?
Yeah, so the structure of this hymn actually is from the Latin O antiphons in the Catholic tradition. So an antiphon is just a short phrase or chant that's usually sung in a service in a call and response style structure. So each of the 7 verses of this hymn that we have in our hymnal, each verse is taken from those antiphons from that Catholic tradition.
Nice. I love that it comes from long ago, that we're taking it from tradition and it becomes part of us and we are a part of it. That's really beautiful. And so as you are talking about that, that's where it comes from. And those things were meant to educate, to help people understand something about the history of Christianity and what God does for us. And this hymn often sounds kind of plaintive to me. It sounds like there's this deep longing. And the words, of course, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that Israel is somehow in a place that they need to be saved. And so that comes through in the music also, I think.
Yeah, so the beginning of this hymn starts on an E minor chord. So this initial minor sound, often when we use these minor keys and minor scales, it kind of gives this more kind of maybe eerie, maybe anticipatory, but definitely not a solid, happy kind of feeling. So we start with this minor tonality in the first half, and then when we do get to the refrain of the rejoice, rejoice, now all of a sudden we're using our G major harmony, and that sound of that major chord gives us this arrival, this rejoicing, this arrival of Emmanuel.
That God is finally with us, that we are not alone. And that is such a powerful message, especially during a year when we've struggled, and we may not have been sent into exile necessarily, literally. However, at times we have felt like it's not normal and that there's some oppression. It feels heavy because this is something we've never dealt with before. And so the message of this hymn, I feel, is so powerful even in our own time. And that's what's so beautiful about Scripture and about hymns and all of the traditions of the church, because they speak to us in our own time as well as in the time that they were written. This particular hymn seems to hop around through Scripture, but I think it's because of what Rachel talked about with the antiphons, that the antiphons are educating us and they've been pulled from different pieces throughout the Scripture to remind us of God showing up and God being with us, which is the plaintive request here. Another thing that I think is interesting in this hymn is that some of the terminology that's used, which we are not familiar with all the time. They use the word ensign in verse 4. Depending on which version you're listening to, it talks about an ensign, which is really just a symbol. It's a symbol of something bigger. And in that particular verse, I think it talks about the root of Jesse's tree, which is again speaking about this symbolic thing in Scripture, which talks about Jesse was David's father. King David was important to the history of Israel. And Jesus comes from that line of David. And so it's pulling us all the way back through history. It's just a few words, but it is very powerful because it keeps the hope alive, because all of these things that have been promised are now being fulfilled.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of this, idea of the different terminology, we can also talk about the fact that this text is translated from Latin. And because of that, translations can change. So the version that's in our hymnal isn't necessarily the version text-wise that you would hear maybe from either a different hymnal or just a different arrangement of this piece, not because it's really saying anything different, but because the translation by the translator was just changed. So that's a really interesting component of this piece as well.
And talk a little more about that, because I've heard you talk about this before, where the words themselves are important to not only the poetry, but how they're fitting to the music.
Yeah, the inflection. So with music, we have things like meter and rhythm that give us direction for the inflection of the music as we sing it. So when you think about the text being laid on top of that, it's important to consider the inflection of the natural style of speech. So when you're translating from a separate language whose inflection isn't necessarily the same, to simply lay it over top the same music is oftentimes going to produce something that feels a little bit clunky and just a little bit off. So the translators not only have to make sure that when they are taking the text from Latin to English that they're conveying the message, but that they're also keeping in mind how that the poem that they translate it into is going to be affected by the rhythmic structure of the piece. So that's just another layer for this one.
Yeah. Another thing that I love about hymns and scripture and the tradition of the church is this idea that even though these things were written about something in the past, they also reflect our own lives and things that happen today, that we can either take heart from what has happened in the past or apply it to ourselves today. And I think this particular hymn, talking about oppression and the difficulties that we've gone through in our lives, it could be oppressiveness feeling because we have some kind of illness we're dealing with. Or it could be that there are powerful people around us that feel oppressive to us. Or the darkness of the season itself may feel heavy to us. Or we could have difficult relationships or jobs. But the thing about this hymn is when we get to the major part of the hymn, the major
Harmony,
chords,
yep.
harmony, right, is the hope. That the rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to us, that we are not alone, that God is with us. And that's just so powerful. We have to remember that and keep that in our hearts. What other things do we need to know about this, do you think, Rachel, before we send people out to listen to it?
I think one more interesting concept of this piece, as you were kind of talking about how it's definitely applicable to us in our world today, even though it's such an ancient text and an ancient story. One thing to note is that the actual hymn tune is a French traditional carol. So, just thinking about, okay, so the text is from the Catholic, the Latin antiphon, which, we would trace back to Italy, but then the music is from France, and then here we are in the United States, performing this music. So it's just kind of a really wonderful representation of this story and how it kind of transcends any one area or one kind of style of thinking, but more of a whole world.
I love that. So even though we look at the history of Israel, we can apply it to us, to our world, to all of Christianity, to God being with us through history, all of that. So we are so thankful that you are listening to this podcast to give you a little bit of an idea about some of the extra music in Advent that you can listen to.
Yes, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join us next week. This podcast was made possible by Powell United Methodist Church, and we are so grateful for the opportunity to be here and share this with you.